Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. With 3.25 just around the corner, I wanted to point out one of the key things that I think a lot of people aren't discussing about their league start preparation. There's a huge amount of discussion online about builds, but what's the difference between people who finish the 4th day of the league with half a mirror in a sorted currency, maybe they've got themselves 8 mirror shards, 25 divines, and a bunch of other assorted gumball stuff, and then there's another group of players who play just as much, but at that same time, they're sitting on 5 divines and maybe 10 divines worth of gear. The key difference between them is a question of strategy. It's not just about having a build for league start, it's about having a build and an atlas plan that complement each other. In this video, I want to look at a whole number of different potential currency making and atlas strategies you could use in patch 3.25 and have a look at the sorts of demands that they put on your character. For some people watching this video, I think you've got your heart set on a particular build. Maybe you're determined you're going to check out the new Gladiator no matter the cost. If that's the case, there's a number of atlas strategies you can just write off as not being suitable for you. For example, if you're dead set on going with a Gladiator, I would suggest that you don't focus on Heist and that you don't focus on Legion. Neither of these play well to the strengths of the character that you're building. For some of the rest of you that are trying to decide on a build though, you might have already decided, I want to play the Sanctum this league. I've never learnt the Sanctum, I skipped 3.20, I've never really played it much, and I want to know how to build around it. Well, we'll be talking again about the demands the Sanctum puts on your character, and some of the best ways to answer them in this video. Anyways, let's get started. The most important point is that there are some builds that just shine in certain content. You want to select a character plan and an atlas plan that mesh together well. You don't want to simply pick a good character and a good atlas, because you'll end up in a spot where you've got a fantastic explosive trapper that can rip apart Tier 17 map bosses, that can rip apart the Uber Maven in seconds, but at the same time you're trying to run legions in maps and you're not having a very good time of it. What you want to do is pick what's more important to you, either a particular type of content you want to engage with, or a particular character build you want to play. And once you've got either an atlas decided upon or a character build decided upon, then use that to influence the other choice. Let's go through all of the things you'll think about when you're making this decision. The first thing we want to talk about though is the Settlers of Kalgur league mechanic. Now we know very little about this. Grinding Gear Games have stayed very quiet about a lot of the ways that this is going to work. What we do know though is a lot of things in this mechanic are time gated. For this reason, I think there might be some meaningful slowdown if you fall behind on the league mechanic. And for that reason, I recommend that you at least explore the league mechanic by the time you're getting to white maps, and maybe before that. My personal plans, around about Act 4 and around about Act 8, I'm going to do a little bit with the league mechanic, and then after that, I'm going to come back to it when I'm in white maps, and probably start doing it in every map. The main thing you want to avoid here is a situation where in order to make your mining more efficient, you need to recruit more people. In order to recruit more people, you need resources. In order to get those resources, you need to wait while your miners, your terribly low-level miners, very slowly pick it out of maps for you. That's why I don't think you want to fall way behind on this mechanic. The other thing to note with the Settlers League mechanic is that there is the black market, which is going to provide gear early on, and looks like it's competing with the niche that ROG usually has in trade leagues, but also can potentially give you something that's a bit of a boost to your own character progression. So that may be something that's worth engaging with while you're leveling, to get you a little bit of a boost in power that can then speed you up in future content. Now, if you do want to focus hard on the Settlers League mechanic, it's going to involve fighting in circles, and you're probably going to want to pair it with things that are very fast in maps. Things like in-map shrine events and in-map heist events are both very fast to complete, and those will work well with the Settlers mechanic because they'll let you engage with this mechanic more frequently. I want you to then contrast this to mechanics like Abyss, Ultimatum, or Ritual that add considerable time to each map that you run. Those are going to be less effective in conjunction with the Settlers mechanic. At least we suspect this for now. We may learn more about the mechanic, and it may be that you don't necessarily want to be doing 25 maps an hour with this. It may turn out that it's perfectly fine to run 6 quite juiced maps an hour instead. The biggest forking point you're going to face when you're deciding on an atlas strategy, which will then influence your character build, is whether you want to do an on-atlas strategy or an off-atlas strategy. On-atlas is a term I would use for things that take place in maps. Off-atlas is things like Delve that take place somewhere else. So there's very different considerations if you're wanting to run content like Delve, Heist, Blighted maps. These end up working quite differently than atlas content, especially because they're likely not to interact with the Settlers of Kalgur mechanic at all. Pinnacle bosses can also be considered to be off-atlas. One of the pressures that this places on your build is the amount of dedication to movement speed that your character wants. For example, if you're running Heist or Labyrinth, you want extreme movement speed. If you're running general maps, movement speed's always good, but you don't need as much of it as you do in Heist. And if you're a dedicated boss killer, then movement speed is simply a defensive stat for you. You need enough of it that you can get out of the way of dangerous things, but movement speed is not going to be a multiplier to your loot acquisition the way that it is if you're running content like Heist. I do think it's worth pointing out though that even if you are completely specialised in Heist or Labyrinth or Delve or something completely off Atlas, you don't necessarily need to be specialised in the combatiness circle that we expect is going to be the main focus of the settlers mechanic, but you probably still need some capacity to engage in it because you're likely going to want to go into maps every now and again and do it, just so that you can send off boats and do things like that. Additionally, it's likely you're going to want to upgrade various town buildings. We don't know the exact mechanics of how that works, but just be aware that you're probably going to need to do at least some things in the Atlas this league, even if your planned specialty is not there at all. One thing that you should do, no matter what you plan to do with your Atlas eventually, your first Atlas should be dedicated to unlocking your second and third Atlases as quickly as possible. And I strongly recommend that you take a specific start. That's what you see here. Firstly, you want to exit through Betrayal Chance, because Betrayal encounters in maps are really good at providing you with gear. This is just the Veiled Rares. It's just that they'll be better on average than anything else that you'll get early in progression. Then once you've done that, you want to rush up to Commissioned Officer via the right-hand path, so you're getting Kirac mission chance. And then after that, pick up Shaping the World. And after that, take this cluster of Kirac mission chance. This will get you a solid foundation of Map Sustain and Map Discovery. After that, it's even more Map Sustain. You pick up the other two Shaping clusters, Planar Tactician, and also these 3 points up here, with pathing through this completely harmless keystone. Harmless, but also of no benefit to you. This is again going to be all about Map Sustain and Map Discovery, and this will help you get your Atlas foundations going. There are alternate schools of thought that people have that involve taking Unwavering Vision at the top of the tree, that node that prevents you from getting Scarab drops. The reason that I advise against this is that Scarab generation is extremely good early on. You are going to need to build your own Scarab pool. You're not just trying to get your Void Stones, you're trying to build the foundations of a strong Atlas, and part of a strong Atlas is a strong Scarab pool. You will definitely save time if you spec Unwavering Vision, but then you'll wind up having to spend both time and currency trading for the Scarabs that you would have got anyway. Once you've got these 47 points, you then spec some Scarab generation. Skittering Swarms down here is really good. And then after that, you start specking into your first real mechanic. Something that aligns with what your character's designed to do, something that aligns with what your planned content is going to be. Let's talk though first about some of the off-Atlas options that you've got. And Sanctum is the first one, which is basically Trade League only. In Solo Self-Found, you can have a specialised Sanctum character, but you're going to need another character to feed them Sanctum Tomes, because Sanctum Tomes are pretty rare, they drop everywhere in the game, there's no way you can target farm them. The Sanctum's pretty difficult content, but it's very easy on highly specialised builds. Arguably the best build for the Sanctum at the moment is the Hexblast Miner, and this can be played as a Trickster, it can be played as a Saboteur, or it can be played on other Ascendancies. It's extremely good at the Sanctum content, but it's also perfectly serviceable at getting your own Atlas set up as well. So that's what I would recommend you go with if your plan is to be a Sanctum specialist this league. The Sanctum is really rewarding, it drops a lot of raw Divine Orbs, and it also drops unique relics that allow you to attempt the Sanctum on hard mode, and if you can beat it on hard mode, you'll get an extra bonus. Sometimes these are uniques, sometimes they're additional currency rewards. Some of these relics can be quite valuable, and I especially expect that the relic for Sandstorm Visage is going to be very valuable this league, but it is also going to be rarer than it's been in the past. Sanctum is a really good option if you're playing Hexblast Mines, and it's an absolutely terrible option if you're wanting to play something like a Gladiator that's likely to get hit a lot and therefore fail a Sanctum even though your character is still alive there. The second off-Atlas section of content that I want to recommend is the Labyrinth. And when we're talking about the Labyrinth, there's really a few different versions of it. We'll come to what those are in a sec. The Labyrinth has unique rewards that players definitely want. They want them early and they continue to want them later on as gems get destroyed with unfortunate corruption incidents. Labyrinth specialists can run the level 75 Labyrinth or may elect to run the level 83 labs, and the level 83 labs put considerably different demands on your character to the level 75 ones. So if you're wanting to be a bit of a lab rat, then you want to make a decision. Do you want to focus on move speed in the level 75 labs, or do you want to focus on building a tougher, more well-rounded character for the level 83 labs, but at the expense of having less move speed? One thing I will say here is that it's perfectly fine to set up a character that intends to become a level 83 lab rat, but that starts out in a level 75 lab and just isn't as good as a dedicated level 75 labber, but that has an improvement plan to get into those level 83 labs later on once you're able to afford a bit more gear. So that's another viable option too. There is also a cluster on the Atlas that will allow you to farm your own Labyrinth access tokens more effectively, and this is the only practical way to get the level 83 Labyrinth tokens. This is definitely worth considering if you're spending little time in each map that you run. So level 75 Labyrinth rewards move speed. The Tribute Labyrinth, which is one of the 3 level 83 ones, is pretty close to the only source of Grand Spectrum unique jewels. It requires a well-rounded character, monsters will do more damage there, Azaro will do more damage there, but also the traps will do more damage there, and so you'll have to balance survivability against both traps and monsters. Whatever you do, if you're building a Labrat character, this goes for level 75 labs, it goes double, triple, quadruple for level 83 labs. Do not spec Val Pact. You need to have good passive life recovery, otherwise you are going to go splat because you will make mistakes on the traps sometimes. The Gift to the Goddess Labyrinth is the one that tends to be the most expensive in Trade League. It places similar demands on your character, and it rarely awards Chase Awaken support gems, so you'll need to take a multi-strike with you into the Gifts Labyrinth. You'll have a very small chance of getting a craft that will upgrade multi-strike into Awaken multi-strike when you complete the Gifts Labyrinth. You'll also get a whole bunch of the regular turn a gem into its transfigured version crafts, and you'll also uncommonly, but meaningfully enough to matter, get a craft that will turn a support gem into an exceptional support gem. For example, you put in multi-strike and you get back Enlighten. This one's uncommon, but it's not staggeringly rare, and it's a big money spinner if you're running the Gifts Lab. Finally, we have the Dedication Lab, which is the really hard one. This is situationally lucrative, but it is definitely not something that is always worth running, and it lets you modify corrupted gems into other corrupted gems. It's mostly useful when you've got 2120 gems that have come from League rewards or that have come from divination cards, and you want to try and turn them into something else that might be more useful. For example, there's the divination card, The Terrible Secret of Space, which will grant you a transfigured golem gem that will be 2123. You can then take this into the Dedication Lab, and one of the crafts that you can get will turn this into a different transfigured 2123 gem. Fair warning though, the Dedication Lab requires extreme physical damage mitigation to complete. The traps in there deal 80% increased damage, which is enough that with no physical damage mitigation, it is actually a one-shot no matter your character's life total. It will deal physical damage equal to 108% of your character's life total, plus 64.8% of your character's energy shield total. In short, this is going to wreck you. You must have physical mitigation in order to deal with this, but you can definitely build characters that can survive there and can thrive there. Ultimately, the Dedication Lab is its own animal, requiring a different character slightly to the ones that excel in the Gifts and the Tribute Lab, and the level 75 lab requires different characters again, because the optimization there is movement speed rather than being a more powerful character all around. If you're looking to get into the level 75 Labyrinth farming, Pathfinders tend to be among the best options there, because they tend to be really good at getting a lot of movement speed. And if you're looking to do the level 83 Labyrinths, I personally am partial to the Champion, although lots of other people like the Juggernaut there. You could also make a Chieftain work, and you could probably make a Gladiator work as well. No discussion of off-Atlas strategies is complete without discussing Heist. This is the mechanic with the lowest defensive requirements other than Sanctum. It strongly incentivizes investing into movement speed on your character, even at the expense of sacrificing quite a bit of DPS and quite a bit of survivability in order to do this. Ultimately with Heist, your goal is to run as many of them in an hour as you can, and you don't need to be very fast at killing monsters in order to do that. Personally, if I'm playing around with Heist, I like rushing to level 83 Heist, but there is definitely another strategy people like, and that is to focus on level 67 ones. Both of these work, they just have different rewards. Now, early in Trade League, blueprints drop exceptional rare items. So you definitely want to keep this in mind. You won't necessarily find something for your own character, but you'll find something that someone else can use. There's also a lot of uniques that only drop in Heist. It has more unique items than any other mechanic I can think of, and it also has some other niche rewards that become more valuable later on, like tailoring orbs and tempering orbs. Also, did I mention that every single blueprint wing has about a 5% chance to have a divine orb in it, so that's another real bonus if you're running Heist. Now, if you are running Heist, you still need to do the Atlas, because you're going to want to be able to self-farm Heist materials using the Kirac mod for Heist sometimes. Then you will have a Heist Atlas set up alongside it. Even though your Atlas doesn't help you in the Heists themselves, your Atlas will help you sustain your Heists when you need them, and save you a little bit of time trading. Setting up a Heist Atlas tends to go pretty well with Shrines, because they're both really fast mechanics, and the Shrines will actually make you faster at getting to the Heist caches. So taking both Heist and Shrines takes about 70 points on your tree, and that means that you've got a whole bunch of space left over to spec something else if you're interested in it as well. It's very important to note that in Heist, kill proliferation is more important than single target DPS, and phasing is love, phasing is life. Make sure that you get phasing on your build somehow if you're running Heist, because one of the worst things you can get is body blocked in Heist, where you find yourself being surrounded by enemies, unable to get out of the way, and then donk, something hits you, and you drop all of that juicy stolen loot on the ground. If you're wanting to get into Heist, you want to default to doing deception contracts, they're the fastest, but be aware there are some niche options. A lot of people disregard these. Early on, demolition contracts are the best source of catalysts in the game, unless grinding your games have buffed Ultimatum a little bit more. Counter Thaumaturgy heists will grant you gems with excellent amounts of quality on them. We mentioned earlier there'll be people who specialise in the Labyrinth. Well, those lab rats are going to want those gems, especially the ones that are already 20 quality, because they are simply better to craft on. If you then turn them into another random transfigured gem, then that transfigured gem will remember that it's got 20 quality on it. There's also fragment chests that can be really good, and if you like playing a lucky dip lottery type event, then tapping those jewelry chests will sometimes, not very often, but sometimes, give you an extremely valuable synthesized ring. The next thing we want to discuss is the option of specializing in Delve, which I think is a real wildcard this league. So Delve was beaten in 3.24 for the first time in a league by a character with the charming name of Shitstained Steve. This character reached the hard cap of Delve, which is at depth 65,535, after which you cannot go any further. The thing is that Delve is going to be a complete wildcard for loot this league, and so if you are thinking of specializing a character for Delve, and often it is builds that scale mana aggressively that are the best ones for Delve, it's not really clear yet as to how lucrative it's going to be. The Val aspect that drops from Ahuatotli the Blind is going to be cheaper this league because the Adorned has been nerfed pretty hard. At the same time, All's Uprising is another major reward from Delve, but it's now got a divination card which may bring the price of it down. The nerf to the Adorned means that people will be less interested in using voices, and particularly the voices one socket option, which means that the Luminous Trove divination card is going to be cheaper in this league than it's been in the past. But all of these changes may mean that fossils become more lucrative in Delve, because people are still going to want them, and especially without the Necropolis mechanics providing a really deterministic way to craft powerful items, people are going to be looking for more of these RNG tools like fossils in order to make up for that loss. So, we may see a situation where Delve ends up being pretty lucrative again because of the fossils, or we may see a situation where Delve is just simply much less valuable than it's been in the past. It takes a lot of setup and a lot of commitment to get into Delve. You realistically need to get to about depth 300 before Delve feels good at all, and to 400 before it starts feeling like you're getting any real rewards out of it. That's going to take a whole bunch of time. If you are keen to get into Delve though, I would suggest that you check out Connor Converse, or One Mana Left on Twitch, as he's someone who really focuses a lot on Delve, has a number of guides for it, and will be able to provide you with better character advice than I can. Generally speaking though, mana scaling builds have been the way in Delve for quite some time, and I don't think that that's likely to change this league. The next option that you want to consider is whether you want to be a dedicated boss killer. Now I'm not talking here about what I term casual bossing, which is doing your own Voidstone bosses, maybe doing other milestone unlocks like your first tier 17 map, or even doing one or two uber pinnacle bosses just to prove that you can do them. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about bossing here is making a character that is absolutely dedicated to boss killing, and who spends most of their time trading for access tokens to bosses, then going and killing the bosses, and doing this on loop. Boss killing in softcore trade is all about optimizing the number of bosses that you can kill per hour, and this requires highly specialized characters. One of the things you can do if you're interested in this scene is carry other players through milestone fights they can't complete themselves. There's going to be a number of builds this league that specialize in retaliation skills. Although those builds are likely to be able to do their own Searing Exarch and Eater of Worlds fights, they might struggle quite a bit with their fight against the Maven, and in particular with their fights against the Infinite Hunger and the Black Star. In that situation, you can come to their rescue, bail them out of the fight they can't beat, in exchange for currency from them. And of course, there are harder milestone fights as well, most notably that tier 17 unlock that people are going to want. One option if you're interested in getting into boss killing in a serious way is Explosive Trap. Fearless Dumbo has a guide to that. It's definitely not a playstyle for everyone, but it is something that's very effective as a boss killer, but there's plenty of other options as well. Another off-atlas thing you might want to consider is running Blighted maps. Now, when I'm talking about Blighted maps, I am including Blight-Ravaged maps in this, because they're fundamentally the same type of content. Here, what you really need is kill proliferation. You don't really need single target DPS, because your towers can pick that up for you. What you need to do is have the ability to kill one monster, and have it propagate that kill all the way through the line. The best way to do this, I think by far, is to play a chieftain. There's a number of ways that you can do this, but you want to be an ignite-based chieftain, and those Hinakora explosions that deal 500% of the dead monster's health as fire damage to everything around it. When one of them procs off and it ignites, and then the Ignite proliferates through some sort of proliferation mechanic, it's just going to obliterate an entire row of the Blighted map. This will happen often enough that you'll remain in control, and while sometimes you might need to do a little bit of cleanup of bosses that got away, ultimately this is the easiest way, in my opinion, to do Blighted maps and Blight-Ravaged maps. As well as this, you'll also want Ring Anoints on a Blight specialist character, but those are something that don't have any real opportunity cost, other than of course you're spending oils on them. You can also achieve much of the same goal with a Detonate Dead Ignite Elementalist build, which is the other thing that I would say is a real shining star in the Blight maps. It's worth noting that Blighted maps and Blight-Ravaged maps are going to have new loot. Several things are being added to them. Double Anointed Amulets are going to be added into the Blight-Ravaged maps. Most of these are going to be trash, but occasionally you might get one that's really good. And you should learn what's worth Chance Orbing and what's worth Mythic Orbing, because some of the best amulets in the game will be generated this way. The big thing though that you want to look for, the new top tier armor bases, the new top tier glove, helmet and boot bases, you want to look for these, especially if you can get unusually high quality on them. Anytime that an item drops with quality in the game now, instead of being 1 to 20 RNG quality on it, it'll be 1 to 30. And so there's a small chance that you'll find a 30 quality Royal Plate or one of these other special bases. If you do get this, you're going to want to trade for a Black Morrigan and a Phenomenal Plagued Arachnid and do a 3-way split on it so that you can optimize the amount of value that you get out of your very, very lucky drop. Should you elect to sell it unsplit, you'll just be donating a whole bunch of your hard-earned currency to one of the flippers that will quite happily take it off your hands. Now, one more category of off-Atlas content that you can engage in is being what people term a Hideout Warrior. This is not going to be a guide to being a top-end crafter. The trick is that you don't want to chase the most competitive items, you want to find the most undersupplied ones. Also, it's really good to do crafts where you can fail with style. You're trying to make one thing, you accidentally make something else, and you recognize, oh yeah, I'm going to sell that. So the first rule of Trade League, don't destroy, i.e. roll over, a good item when you're trying to chase a perfect item. Instead, sell a good item and start over. There are of course exceptions to this, and that's when you're dealing with a base that's extremely expensive and where most of the value of the finished product is going to be in the base itself, like a Simplex Amulet, a Focused Amulet, a Helical Ring, or a very good synthesized item. The final off-Atlas thing I want to talk about is Logbooks, or Logbooks in general, but I tend to think that Rog is the one that's best early in the league. So Expedition is really rewarding if you understand it well. The black market though, this is the new thing that allows you to buy well-rolled rares for gold. This may kill Rog off, and we don't know yet. We're not going to know until people start reporting how good the black market is. Rog may still find a place. It's just unclear now whether Rog will eclipse the black market will eclipse Rog, or whether they'll both find a place to shine. Ultimately though, they may well be producing similar items to each other. Now, Expedition favours damage over time proliferation, or attacks that have Trinity, and kill proliferation like explosions. The reason for this is that there's a number of things on the Remnant mods that can undermine various strategies players use. To take what I think is the very, very worst case scenario, if you're playing a single element damage build that is instant application, critical strike, spell based, you've got no real way to get around monsters getting spell block, so remnants that give monsters spell block are scary. They don't actually brick you, but if you get 2 of them, they're really nasty. And even if you get 1, it's kind of rude. Then on top of that, you are somewhat bricked by monsters being immune to critical strikes, which is a remnant mod. And on top of that, anything that makes them immune to your damage type is also going to brick you. So that's one of the worst case scenarios. You've got to look out for a lot of different remnant mods that you can't do. A lot of other builds though, it's not quite as bad, but there's probably 1 or 2 remnant mods that your character can't do. And as a result, you should keep an eye out for those. The builds that have the least problem with this are single element damage over time builds, and also attack builds that spec into the mastery that reads enemies cannot block your attacks. And one last point with Logbooks and Expedition in general, read the Remnants or die wishing that you had. Now there is a big bonus to being level 90 in Logbooks, and that is that Rog, and less importantly Gwenin as well, but Rog's the one you care about, from level 1 to 89 they are absolutely banned from offering you item level 86 items, but from level 90 and up they can give you item level 86 items, which means that a number of item slots become quite a bit more appealing at that point. But early on, especially days 1 and 2, it's perfectly fine to use Rog even if you're not level 90 yet, and that's because on days 1 and 2, items that won't sell later will still sell, and so it can be really lucrative in order to focus on Rog even then. We're shifting over to Atlas-based strategies now, but the first thing I wanted to point out is something that is much less build-specific than anything else on this video, and that is Scarab generation. Some Atlas trees are better than others at generating Scarabs, and Unwavering Vision on the Atlas grants you 20 additional points, but completely bricks your ability to generate Scarabs entirely. Early on, there is that fork in the path that I mentioned earlier when we're talking about getting your Atlas started. That is, do you take Unwavering Vision in order to speed up your acquisition of the rest of the maps on the Atlas? My advice here is that you don't take Unwavering Vision, because you want to be building a cohesive whole of an Atlas, not just filling out the Atlas, but also having a Scarab pool to go with it. And the self-sabotage on your Scarab pool that you'll get by taking Unwavering Vision is going to set you back in ways that you'll then have to trade in order to fix. The exception here is if you're a racer, or if you sincerely think you can be one of the first few hundred people into various endgame bosses, and in that situation, yes, it's perfectly reasonable to take Unwavering Vision and just accept that you're going to miss out on those Scarabs, because you'll be making so much on those early boss kills that you can then easily pick up a whole bunch of Scarabs instead. I don't think it's a problem to spend an extra hour in yellow maps if that's going to mean that you'll come out of it with a Scarab pool. So when you start doing tier 13, 14, 15 and 16 maps, you've got Scarabs to start using on them, and you probably get a couple of jackpot Scarabs as well, which you can then turn around and potentially sell in order to fund gear upgrades for your character. Now when it comes to Scarab generation, there are two nodes that stand out above everything else: Remarkable Relics and Skittering Swarms. Remarkable Relics causes Scarabs to bias towards uncommon Scarabs, and Skittering Swarms simply causes more of them to drop. You should take these early during yellow maps, so that you can have Scarabs that are aligned with your Atlas plan to use early on, and also Scarabs to sell. I'm intending personally to take Skittering Swarms as my 50th point, and Remarkable Relics will be approximately my 60th on my Atlas. Skip these only if you're not killing very many monsters per map. The first Atlas mechanic I want to discuss is Beyond. I think Beyond could be in a considerably better place this league. There's a few reasons for this. Firstly, the changes to tainted currency. This is actually a nerf to tainted whetstones and armorer's scraps, but it's a nerf both to how frequently they drop and also to what they do. The nerf to what they do is neither here nor there. They weren't worth very much anyway. The key thing is that their drop frequency is being dropped, and that may result in an increase in the amount of other tainted currency. That's generally the way it works. If one mod on an item becomes rarer, then other mods that compete with it tend to become more common. So we'll see how that works. It may be that the more useful tainted currencies, Jeweler's Orbs, Fusing Orbs, Mythic Orbs, that these become more common as a direct consequence of these changes. The other thing is that Beyond's new Scarab is going to synergize really well with anything that puts a lot of monsters in one place. So this is Abyss, this is Ritual, this is Blight, potentially even Ultimatum. This is going to have tremendous synergies with the changes that are taking place to Beyond, and that Scarab that got giga buffed. At the same time, the Black Morrigan has been made rarer. Now that might seem like it's got nothing to do with Beyond because it's a beast, and last league it was its own Scarab. But what this is going to mean is that there's going to be potentially more tainted fusings dropping from Beyond, but also more demand for tainted fusings as well. And tainted Mythic Orbs are incredible if you understand them. I made a guide to how they work, and I'll put a link to that in the description of this video. So what sort of characters do you want for Beyond? You want something that's fairly tanky, and you want something that is good at fighting multiple rare monsters at a time. Honestly, I think this is one of the places that the Gladiator could shine brightest, because the Gladiator can do a whole bunch of damage to multiple targets at once using retaliation skills, and Beyond is the sort of content where monsters do a lot of small hits to you, which means you'll be in a really good spot to use those potentially very powerful retaliation skills. So that's one thing I would consider with Beyond. The other thing I would consider here though is anything that's good at Blight. So Detonate Dead Elementalist could be really good here, as well as any of the chieftains that ignite off Hinekora explosions, because there's the sort of thing that can happen where you kill one monster and its corpse lies on the ground with an ignite proliferation coming off it, and then Beyond monsters spawn on top of that and they pretty much fall over straight away. Not suggesting these are the only options for Beyond, but I do think that they're ones that should shine pretty brightly. The next strategy I want to talk about quickly is Ultimatum. Now, Gladiator and Chieftain are probably the best here, somewhat tanky and very solid kill proliferation. That said, I do not generally recommend Ultimatum as an option. The loot that it drops is extremely niche Mythic Orb bait, which requires quite a bit of experience to be able to recognize what's good. This is double corrupted rare items. Then, on top of that, a lot of those aren't very valuable early on. It's also very RNG heavy on the rewards. However, one very important exception. You probably won't get Relic of the Pact on day one, but if you do get Relic of the Pact on day one and you're playing Ultimatum, you're going to be rich. The people who want that item generally will pay a lot for the first one that comes onto the market because it's very, very central to boss killing strategies. While somewhat off meta at the moment, definitely work. And so if you get one of the first ones on the server, you'll be able to name your price for it. The next strategy is the quintessential kill monsters in a circle approach. This is Ritual. Kill proliferation here is absolutely godly. Now Ritual's being reworked, it's getting a bunch of new rewards in it. Ritual's tier 2 rewards, which are the ones that cost approximately 6,000 favour, will be getting a new superstar in them, which is the access token to the King in the Mist fight. King in the Mist fight was in the Affliction League, and it was something you could get as an RNG encounter in maps. Now it's going to be something that you can get as a standalone event. This is going to be added into the Ritual tier 2 rewards. You probably won't see it very often, but when you do, you'll be really happy about it. It's worth noting that Ritual is getting hyped a bit. The more people that do a mechanic, the less lucrative its special rewards become, and the more that they'll be undercutting wars on selling various things from it. So that may end up being something that goes against Ritual. It's a mechanic that a lot of people do like, but that it's also one that adds a lot of time to each map. In terms of builds that do well in the Ritual mechanic, there's a lot of different things you can play. I think Chieftain Righteous Fire is arguably the very best of them, but Gladiator builds are good. Elementalist builds are really good if you are good at dodging. If you're not good at dodging, then you'll probably be too squishy, but if you are very good at mechanically dodging things, you're sort of player that does well in hardcore, then Elementalist will pay off well in Ritual as well. Ultimately, Ritual may still be a very good choice. I'm just a bit apprehensive about it because it's being hyped so much. The next mechanic we want to discuss is the in-map aspects of Blight. So most of the things that we said earlier about Blighted maps do also apply to the in-map Blighted events. It's just that you got to move around a bit more in these, so having a bit more move speed is good. It's worth noting that the Scarabs for this mechanic are absolutely god tier, at least some of them are. Especially the one that causes maps to drop upgraded to Blight-Ravaged maps. Now there's a couple of things that mean that Blight is going to provide less gold oils than it has in the past. Paradoxically though, this may actually make it more lucrative than it's been, and may just mean that people who want a gold oil anoint are willing to pay more for it as a result. The first thing is that the Scarab that upgrades the tier of oils is completely gone, and secondly, oil extractors are completely gone, including in standard. So this combination of effects is going to mean that you will get a lot less gold oils while you're running Blight, but each one of them is likely to be worth quite a bit more. Then, of course, Blight-Ravaged maps and Blighted maps are then going to have the new Prismatic oil as well. Now I mentioned that the Blight Scarab Blooming is the one that causes Blight-Ravaged maps to drop. This one is really, really important to a Blight strategy. You want to be buying these with the trade market early on, so just start picking them up. Even if you can only pick up a small number of them, this is exactly the thing you can use the trade market for. Before you go to bed on the first night after you're solidly in maps, just put up a buy order for a few of those at whatever you think is a price you're happy to pay, and then the next morning, hopefully you come back to have some of these Scarabs already aside for you, so that you don't need to delay your mapping when you're ready to go with them. It's worth noting that there's a new notable on the Atlas passive tree, Templar Ingenuity, that just has a few cryptic texts about disassembling Blight towers after Blight fights. We don't know whether this is any good or not. We're going to figure that out over time. So it does unknown, potentially cool things. I recommend you try it, you experiment with it, and if it's terrible, you laugh at yourself for taking it. Next on the Atlas, we're going to continue looking at the left side of the tree Atlas mechanics that are blockable. And this time we're going to look at the in-map aspect of Heist. So we've already talked about playing a character that specializes in running the heists themselves, going to the Rogue Harbour, and not really going to maps very much. But there is also the in-map heist events, which is just forcing additional smugglers' caches onto your maps. This is actually quite different to specializing in running the heists themselves. This strategy focuses on generating heists that you will then sell to other players who will run them, or alternately, that you'll pass over to an alternate character, or maybe you do both parts yourself on one character. But you don't necessarily need to ever set foot in the Rogue Harbour for this strategy. The key advantage here is that it's fast, and it doesn't compete for Scarab slots with other strategies that you might be considering. So that's one of the reasons I would advocate that if you've got points on your Atlas tree you're not sure what to do with, Heist is something you can always spec into, because there's a lot of demand for those Heist blueprints. Now with Heist generation, you can do it in any tier 16 usefully and the blueprints will sell well. You still need to pay attention to a couple of things when you're selling them. Firstly, deception contracts are worth much more than any other contract, and secondly, fully unveiled prints are worth much more than base prints. 3-wing and 4-wing prints are different to each other, so there'll be one price for blueprints that aren't unveiled. There'll be either 1 of 3 or 1 of 4. There'll be another price for 3 of 3 wings, and there'll be another price for 4 of 4 wings, and you want to separate your blueprints into 3 groups accordingly. Overall, 90% of the blueprints that you drop in tier 16 maps will be in that 1 of 3 or 1 of 4 category, 5% will be in that 3 of 3, and 5% will be in that 4 of 4. But those two rarer categories, even though they're only a 10th of your blueprints, they'll be about half of your income from a heist strategy. Now I personally like pairing Heist on the Atlas with destructive play, which is something that we'll come to much later in this video, as both of them play to the same strength of a spend minimal time in each map doing side content strategy as possible. The idea is that both of them want you to do as many maps as you can per hour, and they don't really push you to juice those maps very much or spend very much time in each of them. The Settlers League mechanic should also scale pretty well along this same axis. You don't want to spend all that much time in each map, because then you'll be able to get more access to all of these once per map events. Now there is a proc that will cause you to get 6 additional Smuggler's Caches in maps. This thing's pretty rare, but when it procs, you want to really make sure that you check the entirety of the map, check all the nooks and crannies, because every Smuggler's Cache you open is better than the previous one with a Heist Atlas. The game doesn't actually tell you when this proc goes off, but you'll develop an intuition for it pretty quickly, because it really does stand out. One other thing that you can combine with this setup, in addition to a Heist setup, you can go with the Mining Byproducts node that is in the Delve support on the tree. This will cause you to get a whole bunch of Azurite, which again adds basically no time to the maps. All you need to do is just click 3 things, and 1 in 10 times that you click a Niko poo pile, you'll end up getting a whole bunch of Azurite as well. Azurite can't directly be sold, but it can be turned into resonators, which can be sold to other players. What sort of characters do you want here? This is again one of those situations where it's perfectly fine to sacrifice a little bit of offense or a little bit of defense in order to move fast. The Heist Atlas setup works really well with anything that's quite zippy. Ultimately, anything that moves at least as fast as a Deadeye will feel really good with this setup. The next mechanic we want to talk about is Delirium, and this is a complex one. There's essentially several different mechanics that all bundled together into Delirium. There's Delirium layered maps, Delirium mirror in-map events, the Simulacrum, and the Eternal Delirium mirror strategy. And all of them work differently. I'll point out that Simulacrum is something that's off Atlas. I didn't talk about the Simulacrum earlier on because it's being really hyped this league, and that may actually make it a bad choice to run, but if you do want to specialize in the Simulacrum, Chieftains tend to do very well in there because of their kill proliferation, but there's plenty of other things that you can play there as well. So let's start with the Eternal Mirror. This is the strategy where you make the Delirium Mirror last forever at the expense of not getting any Delirium Orbs and not getting any Simulacrum Splinters. The best use case for this strategy is tier 17 maps that use a borrowed power atlas, so shrines in particular, but you still use post-nerf Delve with Packed with Energy, and then you just kill monsters in there and get cluster bases. It's okay to not be able to beat the map bosses, especially when they're delirious, because they're going to be quite hard, but all you're there for really is those cluster jewel bases. You can also get further borrowed power by bringing Huck into the map with a Heist setup, and you can also pick up even more borrowed power, although this is the weakest of them, by having Einhar show up as well. Einhar can be quite distracting for monsters, and they'll often focus on him for a while, which then means they're not attacking you. The next option is the Delirium Mirror with the timer, so you're not allocating Eternal Nightmare, you're having it so that the Delirium Mirror is timed. This requires a very, very powerful character, and it's best for generating Simulacrums you can sell to other players, or maybe you elect to do those Simulacrums yourself. Simulacrums will be in higher demand this league, and so I think this could be one of the more lucrative options. As well as that, you'll also generate Delirium Orbs with this strategy, and Delirium Orbs are really, really good now because they can be used on tier 17 maps, and you can bet that there'll be some juices doing exactly that. You do not want to do this in lower tier maps except for practice, and that's because the mirror's rewards scale a lot with the monster level of the zone that you're in. Now with the Delirium Mirror, monsters will be a lot tankier, and one of the things that people do in order to neutralize this is freeze proliferation. If you can freeze one of the weaker monsters in a pack, freeze proliferation effects will then freeze the entire pack that they're with, including the more dangerous monsters that have been giga-buffed by the Delirium Mirror. That's something that can be really good and can buy you that little bit of extra time in order to then kill those monsters off. So do keep that in mind as an option. It tends to be one of the best ways to handle a Delirium Mirror when you're not yet at a high level of gear on your character. Now the next option is maps with layers of Delirium on them. This adds monsters, it adds quantity. You can get these by applying Delirium Orbs to maps yourself, but you can also map with Delirium Scarab of Delusions, which tends to be really cheap. It's not a common Scarab, but it tends to be very, very cheap, and it causes map drops to have a 100% chance to have 1 to 5 Delirium Orbs applied to them. Now it biases towards 1, 2, and 3, but 4 and 5 do come up. This Scarab is uncommon but not really rare in 3.24, so it's not something you'll be able to get very many of yourself, but it's the sort of Scarab that you can just put up a buy order for using the new trade market, and then go to bed one night, come back the next day, and you've got a whole stack or 2 or 3 of Delirium Scarabs of Delusion ready for you to go when you want them. Delirium Scarab of Delusions also pairs really well with Cartography Scarab of Corruption if you want to avoid any effort in rolling your maps, although of course you will end up with some brick maps here. One thing that's important to note is that before you have 4 Voidstones socketed, you'll end up generating a whole bunch of 8 mod low tier maps that you may not have any real interest in doing. One thing you could conceivably do with those is give them to your 3.25 Atlas runners, and then either laugh at their failure, or potentially seize the rewards of their success. So that's the left side of the tree blockable mechanics. Let's get to the Masters now and start with Einhar. Einhar is a complete and utter wildcard. There are changes taking place to Einhar that we don't know enough about, that we don't understand, and the patch notes are not thorough about. For example, some of the beasts that are currently exclusive to one of the Atlas memories are being moved into the core Einhar pool. But which ones? Is this going to be the ones we really care about, like the Vivid Vultures? In that case, then Einhar becomes a lot better. Or is it going to be some of the ones that are less significant, like the one that gives a big burst of XP to an Awakened gem? If that's the case, maybe people will be less interested in that. One thing that's important to note is that the Black Morrigan is now in the core Einhar pool, rather than being something you can add to a map with a Scarab. Now, if you do want to go with Einhar, be prepared to do this in higher tier maps than historical Einhar strategies used. That means you need a character that can deal with powerful red beasts inside tier 16 maps potentially, maybe even inside tier 17 maps. And so where in the past for Einhar I would have recommended going with a Deadeye and blitzing tier 4 maps, now you're going to want to do something quite different, and we're not exactly sure what you're going to need to do. If you are interested in giving 3.25 beast farming a go, then I would suggest that you start with a build that has fairly explosive single target damage, and potentially this could be a trickster version of the Hexblast Miner builds that are really good in Sanctum. Essentially, you want to be able to burst down bosses that can be unpredictable and that can appear in random mapping environments, so you want something that's good at random mapping and that's good at burst damage against single targets. That's my first thoughts when it comes to Einhar, but this is something that everything's new and we really don't know all that much about how exactly everything's going to pan out. So from one of the Masters that we know very little about and that could be very good this league, we're now going to move over to Kirac, who is one that we know everything about and who is going to be pretty dumpster this league, except very early on. Essentially with Kirac, you take him seriously very early in progression, get your Atlas done, then you forget that he exists once you're at 115 maps done, you rush Commissioned Officer on all Atlas strategies and optionally playing a Tactician as well, and then eventually you unspec these points, you forget that Kirac exists, and you go on with your mapping life. Whatever you do, I don't suggest that you specialize in Kirac missions and that you don't make any compromises to your character in order to make yourself better at doing Kirac missions. It's worth noting though, people may not know this, Kirac is bugged, at least in 3.24, with Explorer's scouting reports, and that once you've done every single white tier map that's available, an Explorer's scouting report will generate a yellow tier map or a red tier map, and they'll be downscaled to level 5. They'll be rare, they might still be corrupted, and if you do these, they will count for purposes of unlocking the rest of your Atlas. So this can be a really powerful way to get your Atlas completely finished without having to trade early in a trade league. So this will help expedite getting your non-unique maps completed on your Atlas. The other thing that's worth noting is that there are 3 unique maps that are drop anywhere that are pretty rare. These are the Coward's Trial, Putrid Cloister, and the Twilight Temple. At least those are the 3 that are rare in patch 3.24. A lot of the time people think that because the Putrid Cloister and Twilight Temple don't hold much late league appeal, that they're quite common. That's not the case. They're as rare as the Coward's Trial. It's just that people keep buying the Coward's Trial late in the league, and they're not interested in the other 2. So the other 2 become cheap, but early on, all 3 of these are rare. Kirac's amazing for finding these, especially in conjunction with the singular scouting reports, as well as the comprehensive scouting reports. In Trade League, you want to sell your spare portals to these maps to other players. Doing so will just give you free currency. Likewise, if you get an Untainted Paradise, that's good as well, but instead of Untainted Paradise, we've got another mechanic we want to talk about when it comes to XP, and that is Jun. Jun is the single best source of early league starter, very basic gear that can just get you going. And that's because the rare items that drop from Betrayal encounters will have a Veiled mod on them, which tends to be an overpowered mod in the sense it's better than anything else you're likely to get, and it's quite flexible. So ultimately, while the first Veiled item that you pick up may not be something that's directly useful to you, by the time you've looked at 20 or 30 of them, you'll probably find 3 or 4 of them are significant upgrades for your character. I actually suggest Jun over Essences for getting started on gear, just because you'll get so many more chances early on to get yourself started. Later on, Veiled Orbs are extremely valuable and extremely strong, but they're expensive and they're not particularly common. They come from Katarina and they seem to be in the 25 to 30% drop rate, although we haven't ascertained exactly what that is. The sample sizes are still a bit too small. But where Jun really shines, and the reason that you may actually want to stick with Jun for a while, is the XP that you get from the mechanic in general. Getting to 90 fast is way quicker in conjunction with Jun and safe houses, and particularly intelligence gathering at the north of the tree. Completing your maps grants 10 intelligence for a random Immortal Syndicate safe house. This is absolutely phenomenal because safe houses have double XP and they have pretty good density as well, so they give a lot of XP. And once you get through to the bosses and you complete the bosses of the safe house, you get another burst of XP for them as well. Jun is phenomenal for character XP, and Jun is also phenomenal for gem XP as well. Lots of things going for her. Even though safe house rewards are in a pretty bad place, the overall mechanic is really worthwhile early on. One thing I will add with Jun is that you don't necessarily need to make major compromises in your character build in order to do Betrayal better. You just need to fit in some chaos resistance on your gear. Not so much because of the bosses that do chaos damage. It That Flared, Tora, they both do quite a bit of chaos damage and it can wreck you, but more so because of the trash that they spawn with them. You can dodge It That Flared's attacks, you can dodge Tora's attacks, that's fine, but the trash that they spawn with them tend to be real wrecking balls. And so the only compromise I would say to make to your character is just use an Amethyst ring instead of something else, which is something you probably want to do anyway. And then we have two other masters, Niko and Alva, that are very, very niche and don't really offer very much early on. They have their uses, but they're quite specialized. And whilst Niko's Pact with Energy node is still good, I generally speaking would advise against making any compromises to your build's power in order to optimize for these mechanics, unless you've made a plan that you want to specialize in the Delve Mines generally, in which case you know what to do. We'll move forward to essences now. Essences is something that I said Jun is generally better at getting starter gear for. That said, essences are a powerful crafting tool in general. Now, tier 6 has become the meta from 3.24, and I assume that this stays true. That's because from 3.23 to 3.24, there was a pretty substantial overhaul in how essences worked. The passive tree support was nerfed, the Scarabs were added, and ultimately in 3.24, essences were in a stronger place than they were in 3.23 if you were doing them in tier 6 and above maps, and they were in a worse place if you were doing them in tier 5 and down. In the absence of information to the contrary, I'm going to assume that's still the case in 3.25, so don't do this in white maps, do it in yellow maps or higher. Now, if you're going to be doing essences, you want to have a light boss killer. You're going to want to have a character that can burst down a monster that might have 35 million hit points. Trapper builds are good at essences, Miner builds are good at essences, Penance Brand of Dissipation is good at essences. All of these are really solid options. They're not the only ones, but they'll all work very well. You do need to be using Scarabs for this strategy, and so again, you're going to want to be setting up buy orders for the Scarabs that you're a net consumer of, and at the same time, you want to be selling off all of your excess essences all the time. Definitely take advantage of the trade market a lot for essences, probably more than anything else. Early on, the Greed Essence is probably the best. Later on, the Loathing Essence and the 4 Corruption exclusive essences are probably the best. But the one thing that's going to mess with you more on this strategy than anything else is going to be the limit of 10 trades active at a time. The reason I call this out for essences specifically is that you are not just generating 1 or 2 or 3 products like a lot of other things are. Instead, you're going to be generating something like 25 or 26 different products, and you're going to be a net consumer of multiple different Scarabs as well. That's something you really want to keep in mind with essences. You're probably going to need to remain familiar with the old school trade system as well. Likewise, if you're someone who is not doing an essence strategy but you want to acquire essences, when you're trading, you probably also want to check the old school trade system as well as the new trade market. I still suggest that you don't focus on using essences as a way to advance your own character early. I think Betrayal will do it better. There will come a point where you're going to want to start using essences on your own gear, but that's probably going to be once you can spare deafening essences for it. I don't think that screaming and shrieking essences are as good as what you're going to get out of just drops off the ground with Betrayal. Next up, we're going to look at the things on the right-hand side of the tree that you can block, and we're going to start with Harvest. Harvest comes online really late in progression. It's way better in higher map tiers, and it's way better with uncommon and rare Scarabs. The Harvest Scarab that doubles drops, the Harvest Scarab that causes 3 tier 4 bosses to drop. These things are absolutely sublime when you're running a Harvest strategy. You're going to want them, you're going to want to trade aggressively for them, and you're going to want to sell off your Harvest Goo in order to fund that. You want to build a powerful character before you spec into Harvest, because it's not something you want to be doing in white tier maps very much at all. Harvest value is really unpredictable because of the trade market. We don't know the mechanics of how Harvest trades are going to work. If you have 16,575 yellow goo that you want to sell, is that going to cost 16,575 gold to list? Or is it going to be possible to list it at a more reasonable gold price? Once we know that, which we're probably not going to know until people start listing it, then at that point you can decide how easy it's going to be to trade your Harvest Goo to other players. It may well be that you need to trade Harvest Goo the old-fashioned way. Now, in terms of builds here, Trappers and Miners tend to really excel at Harvest combat encounters. Other builds can do them well, but those builds are really, really good at just not being present when the monsters all spawn, but still doing full damage from around the corner. You can drop a whole bunch of traps or a whole bunch of mines, hide around the corner, and then let the traps and mines clean up the potentially very dangerous initial phase of the Harvest encounter. Harvest is very well known for having after-death explosions on a lot of the monsters, and this is going to mean that builds that need to be in close proximity to enemies to damage them, for example Cyclone, are not going to have a very good time with this mechanic. I would not recommend Harvest if you're planning to play a Cyclone character this league. The next Atlas strategy we want to talk about is Breach. This requires damage projection alongside the ability to be quite mobile so that you can walk over those hands at the same time that you're killing rares. You want to be focused on doing both of these, and the non-rare monsters from Breach are just not that important to it, although you do need to keep the numbers of them down so that you don't get overwhelmed. Gladiator is really untested in Breach. It might be that it's really solid, but it might also be that they don't have enough damage to kill the rare monsters, and particularly the in-map Breachlord encounters, unless they get a lucky time retaliation skill, and even then that may not quite be enough. So that's something that we'll have to find out over time. The key thing is that you want killing the small monsters to be something that helps you kill the big monsters. If you can set up a character that does that well, then Breach is going to be a mechanic that you will do well in. I do want to put one very important caveat. I've said this in a couple of other videos, but it's really important. At the time I'm recording this video, we don't know whether it's going to be possible to use the new spiritual successor of Recombinators that's going to exist in 3.25 to rip the mods off a Grasping Mail and graft them onto other bases. That's going to be something that will have a big impact on the potential power for Breach as a mechanic once we find that information out. If I do find out a definitive answer on that, I will make sure that I communicate it to people. And while we're talking about mechanics that put a huge number of monsters onto the map, Legion is another one of these. Legion is extremely build specific. Bow builds in open maps utterly dominate Legion mechanic. They just do it so much better than anything else. This is the quintessential Deadeye mechanic. If you're playing a Deadeye and some sort of bow build, then you can just dominate Legions once your character has enough damage. It's an outstanding choice for that build, and it's also a completely derisory mechanic for a number of other builds as well. One thing that's important to note is that you can only damage monsters that are within about a 12 to 15 meter radius of your character, and it is possible in Legions that you can start a kill proliferation chain in one place that actually can't propagate to all the monsters in the Legion because it's simply too far away from you in order to be within your radius. So that's something that can be quite frustrating and will happen quite a bit with Legion, but that's something where being mobile, like a Deadeye, really helps. Legion's outstanding, probably second only to the Simulacrum, at generating large piles of miscellaneous loot, and it's also really, really good for building your own Scarab pool, and also to sell to other players. It's also worth noting though with Legion, you really, really, really want to be buying Scarabs that are good with Legion, and then selling the Scarabs that you get that are just of no use to you. Trade market again will be really good for that. One more mechanic to discuss that is also about putting huge numbers of monsters onto maps, and that is Abyss. This is a very niche strategy because it takes quite a while to run. Even though it adds more monsters to a map than a Breach or more monsters to a map than a Legion, the in-map events are pretty slow, so they add a lot of XP, they add a lot of divination card drops, but they also add a lot of completion time. There are good uniques from Abyss, but there's not that many, and they tend to be oversupplied in the Trade League economy pretty quickly, with the exception of one or two of them. Stygian Vices though, they will sell in bulk to crafters. If you've got item level 85 ones and 86 ones, both of them will be sought after. Abyss puts a number of mixed demands on characters. To beat the events at all, you need modest clear speed, but to beat them comfortably, you need really fast clear speed. Then you also need the ability to take down pretty tanky bosses, because you will encounter Ulaman or Amanamu somewhat often, and those are fights that you want to be able to win, because you're going to have a lottery unique in the Darkness Enthroned that will drop a lot, and there's a couple of other things they can drop much less commonly, such as Shroud of the Lightless. In terms of specific builds that I would suggest here, this is somewhere that you might experiment with if you're playing a Gladiator build, mostly because Abyss does a lot of small hits, so your block layers are going to be extremely good defense against those, and also you'll have those potentially very high damage retaliation skills in order to get even with the monsters that have been hitting you. Abyss can potentially pair very well with Beyond as well, and all the things that we said about Beyond earlier on would definitely apply here. If you are running Abyss though, the other thing you can do is run the same Chieftain kill proliferation chains involving Hinekora and Igniting. That's something else that you could seriously consider if you're interested in going down the Abyss route, which would work with a few other things we've talked about as well. Next we have the Expedition in-map events. Now we talked earlier about build considerations for logbooks, and in-map Expedition events are very similar, except that the Remnant mods sometimes also stack with Searing Exarch and Eater of Worlds altars. More than any other mechanic, this pairs well with Eater Altars. If you can handle both of them, they'll go really well together. But from a build perspective, everything that we said about logbooks also applies to in-map expedition events. And now we come to the fourth last mechanic we're going to be discussing, and this is Searing Exarch Altars. It's my opinion these are weaker now than Eater of Worlds Altars were. And this is one of those cases of the mighty falling, because when Searing Exarch content was added to the game, it was quite a bit better than the Eater of Worlds setup. This can be a good thing though, because Embers and Invitations can then be in higher demand, because there's more people running Eater of Worlds stuff, and as a result, the people who want to get the things that are exclusive from the Searing Exarch end up needing to come to you, because there's less other people they can go to. Now, builds that don't care about enemy fire and chaos resistance perform best in conjunction with Searing Exarch Altars. For example, if you're considering Righteous Fire, the only ascendancy you would play it on is a Chieftain here, because the Ramako node is going to overwrite enemies' fire resistance, and whilst this can sometimes not be beneficial, in the context of Searing Exarch Altars giving plus 80% to monster fire resistance, and you might even tap 2 of them in a map, suddenly that becomes a really big deal and really beneficial to you to be able to say, oh, you've got 123% fire resistance, how about we overwrite that to -20? Of course, that's only one way of dealing with monsters with very high fire and chaos resistance. You can also deal with them by dealing lightning damage, physical damage, or cold damage, all of which will work very well here. Another thing to keep in mind with Searing Exarch Altars is that they love putting bad things on the ground, specifically fire. There are builds that are better at mitigating damage over time. For example, a Slayer is extraordinarily good at enduring damage over time, not through actually mitigating the damage in any way, but through simply outleeching it. By contrast, the Gladiator has basically no defenses against damage over time, and so I would say that the Gladiator is pretty poorly set up against Searing Exarch Altars. One of the key things you got to deal with though is surprise spawns on top of you while you're mapping. That's a big part of Searing Exarch Altar gameplay, and also for that matter a big part of Eater of Worlds Altar gameplay. Now it's worth noting there are 2 ways of engaging with these altars, and because the next mechanic is Eater of Worlds, I'll discuss this now. It's going to apply to both of them. These can be done fast or slow. The slow approach is to tap every single altar and just slow down your mapping as much as is necessary to do this. The fast approach is tapping only the best 10 or 20% of altars, running straight past the other ones, and not allowing them to slow down your gameplay in order to get a small amount of loot. Neither of these options is clearly better or worse, and ultimately you should come up with your own balance as to what the best way is, and that should be influenced by things like how sensitive your character is to various altar downsides, like being targeted by meteors when you use a flask. After talking about Searing Exarch, we have to also talk Eater of Worlds, and this is one of the best sources of increased zone quantity you'll find. Eater of Worlds altars, once you spec into them, can give you a very large amount of increased zone quantity for the rest of the map that you're in. This tends to pair really well with mechanics that you can do on your own schedule, and in particular with Expedition, where it will result in you getting more logbooks when you get around to running those in-map expedition events. Now the altar downsides on Eater of Worlds altars can put some really savage demands on your character at times. For example, there are things that will crangle your defenses completely if you've got certain charge types, all sorts of things like that. Note 3 or 4 of the worst ones that affect you as a player, and don't run those altars unless the upside is unusually high on them. And in that case, if you get something that's a huge upside and a huge downside, then what you do is simply run the map slowly and methodically, and then after you've completed this map, then you get back to blasting again. It's fine to slow down if you get one of the very best altar rewards. As long as you read the downsides, Eater of Worlds altars are very manageable. But to get to the point that you can completely disregard the text on them, that generally requires Mage Blood and a whole bunch of other powerful items on your character. Competing, of course, with the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds is Maven Influence, and I want to talk quickly about Maven's destructive play as an option, which is also something that puts some pretty big demands on your character. This is a hybrid mapping and bossing strategy. It's a pathway towards bossing for a lot of people, and it also generates a very large number of Atlas mini-boss maps. When I use this term, I'm talking Elder Slayer Citadels, I'm talking Elder Guardian occupied maps, I'm talking synthesized unique maps, and I'm talking Shaper Guardian maps. Those 4 categories of bosses are what I term the Atlas mini-bosses. Your first approach if you want to go Maven destructive play is to get into tier 16s and spec the Atlas mini-boss map generation nodes. Things like the node at the very top of the tree that causes map bosses to drop Shaper Guardian maps and Elder Guardian maps. Once you're strong enough, and you should definitely hold off on this until you are strong enough, you then want to turn on destructive play and also activate Maven Witness when you're running these maps. This will be in rare tier 16 standard maps. At some point you'll graduate beyond those, and you want to start doing Maven Witnessed but no destructive play Atlas mini-boss maps that are scoured. So you'll do a Phoenix map, you'll turn on Maven Witness, but you'll turn off destructive play. When I say turn off destructive play, what that means is you unspec it for a bit. Once you've verified you can do that, you can then do transmuted ones, or you can turn destructive play back on. The big goal that you want to get to though is step 4. This is where you upgrade to rare Atlas mini-boss maps that have destructive play active on them. At the same time, you want to be running these alongside scoured 4-way mini-boss invitations, like Maven's Invitation the Twisted or Maven's Invitation the Formed. At some point after this, you're then going to be upgrading to step 5, which is where you start juicing those precursor maps, the Atlas mini-boss maps, and you start elking your invitations. And then at some point after that, you'll reach step 6, which is where you've pretty much outgrown the Maven destructive play to some extent. You upgrade to harder invitations like the Maven's Invitation the Hidden, Maven's Invitation the Feared, and tier 17 maps. In terms of other Atlas considerations to pair with this, destructive play pairs well with shrines so that you can borrow power from the map in order to make the bosses easier, and also surprisingly with Heist, because the Heist in map events are so fast. They put no Scarab pressure on you and they don't slow you down, which means those Scarab slots can then get committed to throwing in even more shrines onto your maps. And because the Heist events are so fast, this lets you continue generating both invitations and also those Atlas mini-boss maps. In terms of character power, you're going to need to have a lot of burst damage against bosses. The other thing that you want to consider here though, and most importantly, you want to be able to project heavy damage to multiple targets at once. This is something that a lot of spell and projectile based builds can differ in their ability to do. For example, many Deadeyes can do appreciable damage to one single target, not necessarily superstar level damage, but while they're doing this, they're only just tickling other monsters that are around and not really doing much damage to them at all. Miners tend to be pretty similar. A Hexblast Mine build can do all of this content, but it does have the issue that if you're fighting against, for example, the Phoenix, the Minotaur, and the Chimera at the same time in an invitation, then your mines are choosing to target one of these bosses each, rather than hitting all of them at the same time. If you can set up a character that can hit all 3 or all 4 bosses in an arena at once, whether that be the arena of a map boss that is a destructive play map, or whether it be one of the Maven's own invitation arenas, that's going to perform really, really well in this setup. Somewhere that I think the new Gladiator could shine is in this multiple boss environment, where you'll often be able to block a small hit and then retaliate against it, because a lot of the bosses that you're fighting will spam small attacks at you that will connect with you while you're trying to dodge the big ones, and then you can drop some big bleed eviscerate that tears apart the bosses while they run around chasing you. So that's one possibility, but there's lots of other ways that you could go. Definitely not suggesting that that's the only way to play them. Slam builds are another thing that you could consider here, because slam builds can hit very, very hard, and they can hit a lot of the screen at once. And there's one final mechanic I want to finish with. This is one that I've talked about a little bit along the way. It's not necessarily something you optimize for, although some people will, and this is shrines. Shrines pair very well with basically anything. They make you faster, and they loan you power. They're at their best in tier 17 maps, where essentially they make the rest of the map easier, or other content that you're not quite strong enough for yet. Now, if you are good at fighting map bosses, then Domination Scarab of Terrors, which is very rare, you're not going to get very many of these in your own farming, this is something that's very, very strong, and you might want to consider trading for if you have a Shrine Atlas, because it will allow you to fight a lot of extra map bosses in a map, and it will give all of those extra map bosses that you add to the map this way the chance to drop Atlas mini-boss maps. You'll need to spec into that chance for Atlas mini-boss maps to spawn for this to be worthwhile, but it is a very powerful setup, and something that I would recommend. Shrines don't really put any demand on your character at all, except that you might want to consider whether or not it's worth your while using one of the 2 unique items, either the Gull or Blunderbore, that work well with them. However, shrines are still good even without those. Anyways, that's a whole bunch of different Atlas strategies that you can consider, and most importantly, how they will impact your character build. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results, and don't use one on your League starter.